Our pastor's wife had an affair with a younger pastor in the church, and only my mom and I know the true paternity of her son, but now everything is about to come out in the most explosive way possible. So I never thought I, 18F, would be sharing such personal details about my pastor's life on the internet with strangers, but I just have to get this off my chest, and there's no one in my life I can talk to. Okay, that's not true. What I mean is, there's no one in my life I can talk to about this, because it seems to be affecting everyone in it. And by everyone, I mean my friends, my family, and my entire church. Which I have to admit, is pretty much all the same thing. Because we live in a small town. Everybody knows everybody's secrets. But only me and my mom know the truth about the paternity of our pastor's 17-year-old son, who I'll call Michael. I'll be honest, I'm not super religious, but I've always gone to church with my family, and around here it's just kind of the thing to do. While my parents are usually pretty open-minded, our church is obviously not, so I wish they'd at least find one that was. I've even found plenty and showed them, but they say all our friends and family go here, so they can't go someplace else at this point. Maybe I should just go. Or not go at all. Something tells me I should get out of Dodge before the crap hits the fan. Because a certain someone is about to spill the tea on the almost 2-decade-old affair. And that certain someone is the wife of Michael's real father, who happens to be our youth pastor. That's right. Our pastor's son's real dad is actually the youth pastor. Now I'll tell you how my mom and I are the only ones who know that. Way back then, the head pastor's wife, who I'll call Nancy, was teaching Sunday school with my mom and the youth pastor. I'll call him Pastor Steve. I guess Pastor Steve was having a hard time with his wife Jean at the time, so Nancy sort of became Pastor Steve's shoulder to cry on. One thing led to another, and when Nancy got pregnant, everyone was just so excited. The last thing they would have thought was that her husband, Pastor Bob, wasn't the father. Pastor Bob had been having trouble conceiving a child with Nancy. A low sperm count was the rumor, but how anyone would know is beyond me. So Michael was always looked at as a miracle baby. He may be their only child, but believe me, he's no miracle. Now that he was older and becoming a man, and starting to look more like Pastor Steve than Pastor Bob, there were definitely whispers. But no one really took them seriously. Nancy was the sweetest, most godly woman in the world. A pastor's wife. So to my mom and I, it's all totally obvious. We could see all of this coming a mile away. It's been like a slow-moving car wreck that both of us were helpless to do anything about. And my mom swore me to secrecy about the whole thing. I told her that goes without saying, but she said she knows how irresistible sharing gossip can be. I guess she's right about that. But the thing is, now things are finally starting to spill out into public. Something happened around the time of the big Christmas pageant a few months ago. Something that's probably going to end up being the turning point. Pastor Steve was going to be playing Joseph for like the 12th year in a row. He's quite the sight in his red robe and gold belt, but just before the second of two performances, just before the congregation was pouring in, Jean and him had an epic fight in his office. I can't remember anyone ever so much as raised their voices in church, so when we saw him running through the lobby in the robe crying, it was quite a shock. Especially with the fake beard and stage makeup running from the sloppy tears. Everyone thought that something horrible had happened. That there had been a sudden death in the family or something. But when my mom and I saw Jean come out of the office red-faced and defeated, we knew that it could only be one possible thing. Somehow the performance still went on as scheduled, but everyone could spot Joseph down on his knees in the barn, his heaving little breaths a useless effort not to cry. That performance was on a Friday night, and Pastor Steve didn't show up for Sunday's service. And neither did Jean. Mom and I expected a dramatic announcement from the two of them next week. They were both taking time to examine themselves and their relationship, and Pastor Steve would be taking a long leave of absence. But that never happened. In fact, the following Sunday, the two showed up like nothing had ever happened, and the incident at the Christmas pageant was never addressed. It was hard for my mom and I to just sit back and watch Jean suffer. We knew that she'd somehow discovered the truth. That Steve was the real father of Pastor Bob's son. We just didn't yet know that it was Nancy who had told her. And it was also Nancy who told her to just bury it and move on. How do I know this? Here I need to tell you a little something about my mom. She's nosy as hell. So she decided to invite Nancy to lunch one day out of the blue and feel her out for information. Nancy and my mom went to high school together. They aren't exactly close friends, but they catch up with each other every now and then. I swear, my mom should have been an investigative reporter, not a receptionist at a chiropractor's office. Well, during a long lunch at the Cheesecake Factory, she finally got the whole story from Nancy. It turns out there was a lot we didn't know about our head pastor's wife. For instance, she had no problems with day drinking 3 Appletinis during lunch. Mom stuck with raspberry iced tea, but the booze did loosen Nancy up enough to spill the tea on what she told Jean, and why. And it turned out that she told Jean pretty much everything that happened. She told her all about Pastor Steve needing a shoulder to cry on, or whatever, all those years ago, and that it was all just a big mistake. Of course she loved her son more than anything, but I guess the guilt of hiding a lie from the world had simply been eating her alive for 17 years. Because she'd been hiding it from everyone, even Pastor Stephen. That's right, only Nancy knew who Michael's real father was. But the overwhelming guilt mixed with the fact that Michael was becoming the spitting image of Pastor Steve made her feel forced to act. So, she called Jean one night, a little tipsy, and just told her everything. Apparently Jean was totally stunned, but she'd later admit to my mom that deep inside, she knew the truth. She knew that woman's intuition was a cliché, but in this case it was spot on. And while her natural response would have been to blame all of this on her husband, the fact that Nancy kept it a secret all these years made her hate her just as much, as did the fact that Nancy wanted her to swear that she wouldn't tell another living soul about it. She wanted it totally swept under the rug. As far as Nancy was concerned, the truth about Michael's real paternity was now known by the only person who needed to know it. Somehow her guilt didn't extend to how Michael might feel. If she'd had her way, everyone she knew would go to their graves not knowing, including Michael and Pastor Steve. If he didn't already know. Although he wasn't the sharpest crayon in the box, to be perfectly honest. So, how did Nancy react to finally confessing this and unburdening herself to my mom? Well, not well actually. She started crying, spilled her fourth appletini all over the table, threw up all over the ladies' room and ran out of the Cheesecake Factory crying. And worst of all, she drove home. Thankfully my mom checked on her later and she'd somehow made it home alive. But after Jean knew, she just sat on the information and quietly stewed for a month. And then she decided to confront Pastor Steve about it at the absolute worst possible moment for him. Right before he was about to go on as Joseph for the Christmas pageant for the second show. But like I said earlier, after that everything just went back to normal. It seemed that after Jean's blow up on Pastor Steve, she decided to follow Nancy's orders and put it all in the past. That was 6 months ago, and the thing is, there's no way you can put something like that behind you. Something that huge is bound to come back again. And now that summer's here, and tempers run hot, I have a bad feeling that there's going to be some serious church drama going down. Because Mom and I have noticed a serious and concerning change in Jean the past few weeks. Her usual bubbly, almost annoyingly so, personality has become very introverted and withdrawn, and she even skipped the women's brunch she always hosts 2 weeks in a row. We've been hearing every type of rumor you could imagine. She's had a nervous breakdown, she's in a mental health clinic, she's filed for divorce, she's pregnant. Mrs. Huggington even claims she has a terminal illness. Honestly, Mom and I have absolutely zero theories. All we know is that it has to be related to her this entire fiasco. I'll update you all when and if anything else happens. You know I will. My mom still won't let me talk to anyone else about it. Update 1. So, it's only been 2 days, and yes, today is Sunday, and boy do I have an update for everyone. So once every few months, Pastor Steve gives a sermon instead of Pastor Bob, and today happened to be his day. Mom and I traded some concerned looks when he came up on the stage. He looked haggard and exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. But he gave his sermon, and everything was going as smoothly as usual, until he made an offhand reference to coveting your neighbor's wife. And then all hell broke loose. A woman we at first didn't recognize stood up from the front row and screamed something at the stage. When she ran up onto it and took the mic from her husband, we finally realized that it was Jean. We found out after that in fact she had been staying at a mental health clinic, and this morning she decided to check herself out. The poor woman looked like she hadn't showered in a week, and there was a look in her eyes that said she was out for vengeance. Pastor Steve tried to take the mic back from her, but she shoved him away, prompting a gasp from the old ladies in the front row. Her voice was raspy at first, but leveled out as she began to explain in great detail everything that had happened between Pastor Steve and Pastor Bob's wife. She told the entire congregation that our head pastor's only son, a guy I went to high school with, was a so-called illegitimate child. Of course, every head in the chapel practically exploded with shock. And I'm beginning to think it was for all the wrong reasons. Because as 2 ushers came up and physically removed Jean from the stage, Pastor Steve grabbed the mic and seemed to easily convince the entire congregation that everything she just said was simply the talk of a deranged woman. He calmly explained that yes, the rumors were true. His wife had been having severe mental health struggles as of late and has even been hallucinating. She concocts a crazy scenario about him being Michael's real father, and not even the best psychiatrists in the state can convince her otherwise. I don't have to tell you that my mom and I were fuming, especially when we saw everyone in the place just mindlessly nodding along as we heard poor Jean's cries from the hallway. Pastor Steve somehow then just went back to the sermon like nothing had ever happened. Like his wife hadn't just accused him of serious crimes against the church. Of course, the worst part of all of this was the other family involved was sitting right there in the front row. Pastor Bob, Nancy, and Michael, all next to each other like royalty, forced to watch the horror show unfold. We couldn't see their faces at the time, but they were all standing in the receiving line after, shaking everyone's hands. Pastor Bob had on an obviously fake smile, and Nancy was gritting her teeth through one as well. But poor Michael just stood at the end with a confused look on his face, giving every other person a limp handshake. All the church families will be going out to lunch now, and I'm sure the crazy scene that just took place will be the talk of the table. Probably for the entire week to come as well. We sure do love our gossip. But this is something that simply can't be swept under the rug. But it will be interesting to see how Nancy tries. Update 2. Hey guys, guess what? It's been a week. My parents finally granted my wish for us to find a new church. And all it took was the total implosion of our previous one. Okay, not total implosion. But guess who's currently no longer employed as youth pastor there? That's right, ex-Pastor Steve. This morning's church service was definitely one for the history books. Of course, everyone was whispering about what we may see or hear about when whoever takes the stage. When it was both Pastor Bob and Nancy both, everyone's heads shot up. And everyone's mouths dropped when Nancy began to speak. Much like what she did with my mom, minus the 3.5 appletinis, she confessed the entire story from start to finish. Everything about the affair all those years ago, and ex-Pastor Steve being Michael's father. Apparently the family had a serious discussion about it, and it's true that neither Pastor Bob nor Michael had any idea. But it turns out, there was one more person who knew the truth other than Nancy and my mom. Pastor Steve actually knew much more than he seemed to all these years, and was apparently slightly more intelligent than we gave him credit for. So it was worse than we imagined. Steve knew he was Michael's real father, but denied it for 17 years. Nancy claimed to have gone to him several times over the years and tried to get him to tell the truth with her, but he refused to admit he was the real father. It was only Jean's confronting him during the Christmas pageant and her subsequent nervous breakdown that wore him down into telling the truth. Afterwards, there was simply no way that he could stay at the church. While they are forgiving of almost anything a pastor can do, this was just a bridge too far. Pastor Bob didn't even let him resign. He actually terminated him, which is basically unheard of around here. So obviously we don't know anything about Jean yet. Everything has been very hush-hush. All we know is that she was immediately taken back to the mental health clinic after her outburst, and this time it wasn't on a voluntary basis. Everything about that is wrong. Jean isn't mentally ill. Everything she said was the truth. And if she is mentally ill, she was driven that way by Steve and his years of gaslighting. My mom said that she wants to become closer with Jean at some point and get the whole, definitive story. I told her maybe it's time she lay off for a while. Of course, she's never going to take my advice. I don't take hers, why should she take mine? All I know is, I'm very happy to be going someplace else next Sunday. Any place else.